Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ziauddin Faculty of Law, Politics and Governance podcast. This is your host, Ali Hassam ul Haq, and with me is the brilliant Professor Alexander Lawson. Alex, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hello, Ali. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure as always. So, since we've been chatting about international law and the various modalities surrounding international law, there's been a huge recent development out of the ICC last week, which is that arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu have been confirmed. So, could you shed some light on how this happened and what the process was?
Yeah, well, the ICC is a UN court. It's a court that most of the member states of the world, most of the member states of the UN, most states in the world have signed up to and agreed to be bound by. It has an independent prosecutor who issues warrants. And they issued a series of warrants 6 months ago against Palestinian leadership and Israeli leadership. Now, these warrants have to be confirmed by the pretrial chamber. That's a check and a balance. It's to stop the prosecutor from having too much power just to issue warrants, which might be politically motivated. What happened last week on the 21st of November is that the pretrial chamber confirmed the arrest warrants, which was not a surprise because they always have them in all the previous examples. So we were expecting them to confirm these warrants. The prosecutor is a serious, individually make sure that there's lots of evidence, and the pretrial chamber confirmed them. And all the pretrial chamber has to do is to accept the same standard that the prosecutor has, which is a reasonable grounds for believing that crimes have been committed and they've been committed by somebody who's subject to ICC jurisdiction.
I see. But what's interesting is that, yesterday the news reported that Israel is going to be challenging or appealing these arrest warrants, and which leads to an interesting question, which is that initially the stance that Israel took was that we don't recognize the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, because we're not a signatory to the Rome Statute, much like a number of countries. But now, appealing the same warrants out of a court they don't recognize is kind of sort of paradoxical, don't you think?
Yeah. It requires to explain one thing, which is that the jurisdiction of the ICC can work on two bases, which is the what we call national jurisdiction. So the individual accused is a national of a member state, right? Now, obviously, that wouldn't apply to someone like Benjamin Netanyahu because Israel is not a signatory to the ICC, so he's not a national of a member state. But the other jurisdiction is territorial jurisdiction, and that is that you might be operating on the territory of a state that is a signatory, and Palestine is a signatory.
I see.
That's how Israeli individuals potentially under the jurisdiction of the court. So that explains the sort of the overall jurisdiction. The issue of Israel appealing against a court that they don't recognize is frankly just weird. It's problematic because once you start to engage with a court, you kind of imply that it does exist. It's logically ridiculous to argue that you can make arguments before a body that you don't think has any jurisdiction over you. Because if you're arguing about jurisdiction, then to some degree it does have jurisdiction over you. I don't know how much mileage there is in this, and there's some debates about this. It's happened in other contexts, in other courts, in other times. But yeah, that's the situation. And of course, it would have been legally and politically better for Israel just to ignore the whole thing, just to ignore the legal aspects, and politically to ignore it, because the more you see Israeli government people screaming about how unfair it is, the more it's on the news, and the more it's on the news, the less good it is for Israel. So.
I mean, naturally, yeah. But what's interesting in this entire discussion is the fact that Israel isn't a signatory to the Rome Statute. So what does that mean in terms of the enforcement of this or the execution of the arrest warrant?
Well, obviously, the two states in question where we're arguing about jurisdiction are Palestine and Israel. And as I've said, Palestine is a signatory. So anybody with an arrest warrant against who's Palestinian could be handed over to the ICC. That's not very likely practically, but it is possible. And it's technically possible that Benjamin Netanyahu might somehow end up in Gaza and would then be taken into custody and then handed over to the International Criminal Court. That's staggeringly unlikely, obviously. But what's more relevant is the fact that although Israel is not a signatory, most of the other states in the world are. And for example, just about every state in Europe is, right, with the exception, obviously, of Russia. And that means that because there's an arrest warrant against Netanyahu, if he goes to any state that is a signatory to the ICC, they would be obligated to arrest him and hand him over to the court, right?
Wasn't this very similar to the case of Vladimir Putin on his visit to Mongolia?
Yeah, and what happened, of course, in Mongolia is that Mongolia did nothing. Mongolia were signatories, and they should have arrested him, and they didn't do anything.
What are the consequences of that?
Well, the answer is that there are no immediate consequences. We have signals from states like France saying they would take the same approach. There are some legal debates about it. I'm not convinced by many of them. I think that you accept the jurisdiction of the court and then you enforce its jurisdiction, and that's the point. If you don't like it, you can leave the system. You can denounce the Rome Statute and go outside of the ICC. Some states don't want to do that because it looks bad. So then we have the worst of all possible worlds, which is that they're signatures, but they don't take it seriously.
They don't fulfill their obligations under the...
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's a wicked problem, and we've discussed enforcement of international law, or rather the difficulties in enforcing international law on a previous episode of our podcast as well. But which leads me to wonder, does this have any implications, the arrest warrants, I'm talking about Benjamin Netanyahu, the arrest warrants, do they have any implications on the conflict in general between Israel and Palestine, now that it's officially out there?
Well, it's difficult to speculate on this because the chances of Netanyahu ever actually being brought before the ICC are pretty slim. It's possible to imagine a government change in Israel, in which case they might hand over Netanyahu, but it's possible to imagine it, but it's very, very unlikely. It's very unlikely you'd get a government in Israel that changed that much, that it was willing to hand over Netanyahu as a kind of sacrifice and say, okay, that means we've met our obligations. Israeli politics just isn't like that, and indeed most politics in the world just isn't like that. There's potential political parties in Israel that could be in government, but they wouldn't be 180 degrees opposed to Netanyahu's position. They'd be just slightly different.
But there is news that a lot of Israeli citizens are dissatisfied with the way the Netanyahu administration is actually handling the conflict. And do you think there's a possibility of the people, taking advantage of their political sovereignty and, making something like that happen, or compelling the government to make it happen?
I agree that there is dissatisfaction with Netanyahu, and I think this, in a sense, is Netanyahu's sort of long-term strategy, is that because he's still blamed for not really being on guard when all these the 7th of October attacks happened, his sort of political strategy is just to keep going, keep fighting, and I mean literally keep fighting conflicts, and then that will keep him in government. When the conflict ends, the coalition he's in will collapse and there'll be general elections. But maybe if he goes long enough, people just forget that he was actually in charge when it all went wrong, and they will just see a string of military successes and vote for him again. But yes, I agree that he's not terribly popular. I think the idea, though, that there would be a new government in Israel that would hand him over is just unrealistic. I think
that makes sense.
That the people would regard that as a kind of betrayal of somebody who was maybe not a good leader, but was their leader.
I see. So for sentimental reasons, he might just, walk out of this. All right. Okay. So it leads me to my next question, which is that now, naturally, of course, he hasn't been convicted yet. It's an arrest warrant, and obviously, the assumption in law is that you're innocent until you're proven guilty in a court of law. But the fact that an arrest warrant has been issued by one of the top courts of the world, um, what impact does that have in terms of PR purely at this point to countries which are aligned with Israel or are allied with Israel in terms of giving them military aid or what have you?
Well, I think that firstly, the presumption of innocence argument, I think I would structure it in a slightly different way, which is that it's not that you think the person's innocent. You obviously think they're guilty. It's just that what you do is you put barriers in the way of conviction, right? And the presumption of innocence is one of those barriers. It's saying that the prosecution have to really, really be convincing. But when you arrest somebody, you think they're guilty, obviously.
Naturally.
Otherwise, you wouldn't arrest them.
You have
if
reasonable suspicions.
Yeah, you have reasonable grounds to believe they're guilty. You must believe that there's a realistic prospect of a conviction, otherwise why are you bothering prosecuting? So I don't think it's problematic to say that we can have reasonable grounds for believing these crimes have occurred, and they maybe we could infer they probably have occurred, right? That's not a crazy position to take, shall we say. But going back to your overall question about PR, it depends on the state. If you're talking about states that are signatories to the ICC and that take it seriously and that are already quite hostile to Israel because of what's happened, for them it's a big thing. It's a big nail in the coffin of Israel's legitimacy. For states that are not interested in the ICC, are not members, and are completely Israeli-centric and Israeli loyal, it's just had the opposite effect. In the US Senate, there are moves now to actually introduce sanctions against any state that cooperates with the ICC. Yeah.
Dear God.
So for any state that, for example, did arrest Netanyahu, the US would virtually break off the diplomatic relations with that state or introduce some other kind of very severe sanction. So let's say he ended up in Germany and Germany arrested him. Germany would be subject to sanctions from the US, which they're entitled to do. I mean, it's fairly reprehensible morally speaking. But this has actually been around for a while, this idea that cooperating with the ICC should result in some kind of sanction. But previously it was always, if the ICC issues arrest warrants against Americans, then the United States would respond with sort of bilateral sanctions against the state that arrested them. They're now just extending it to Israelis. It's the same basic idea.
Right, that's insane overreach, though, into international law and kind of using their power to leverage an international organization, or actually leverage, I mean, that's putting it lightly. I think holding an international organization hostage.
Blackmail is a good word. It's depressing because when the ICC was created, there was this idea that maybe the US would eventually end up in its orbit because there were various structural reasons why. But in fact, it's gone the other way around. It's just got further and further away from ever being involved in the ICC. And as long as it's, some African leader from the Congo who's been indicted, who cares, But when it becomes a US ally, then, and particularly, the US, the most close US ally, Israel, then the fact that they have this sentiment means they will interfere. And that creates a powerful disincentive, to a state to do anything.
Yeah, of course.
And an incentive for the state to engage in the kind of legal gymnastics that might get them out of having to arrest the Netanyahu,
So I would like to do a twist on the common phrase that, all sovereign states are equal, some are more equal than others.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, the idea of sovereign equality is rubbish. We teach it as, well, when you teach sovereign equality, you say, look, all states are equal, but do you really think that, China and Bangladesh are equal? No, they're not. One's much more powerful than the other. But the point is, you're equal in terms of your access to the system. We don't say to Bangladesh, well, you can't go to the International Court of Justice because you're too poor. But the problem is that this position, where you have the United States bullying states, means you're not even equal in accessing the system. You really are completely unequal. You know, and it's just standard politics. If you're, it doesn't even have to be a threat. It can just be the absence of an incentive. You might be, Pakistan. You might be expecting the U.S. to spend, $500 million on education programs in Pakistan, and it does spend significant money on these kinds of programs. And then it just turns around and says, if you do anything that any sort of cooperation that we don't like, then we just won't give you the money, right?
Terrible.
Now, of course, I mean, Pakistan's not a member of the ICC, so it wouldn't be.
But I get the example.
But the same principle could apply to any state.
No, absolutely.
Um,
But I want to focus in a little bit more on the specific details of the arrest. So, was there a specific crime that was leveled against Netanyahu? Was it generally genocide? Was it crimes against humanity? Was it war
no,
crimes?
it wasn't genocide. It was crimes against humanity and war crimes. And without getting too much into the details, because the details are quite detailed, and you can read an article I've written about this that explains it. There were some fairly strange decisions made. They didn't confirm every single one of the indictments, but they did confirm enough for it to be serious. There were some odd situations where murder was treated as a crime, but it was not treated as a crime for the purposes of both war crimes and crimes against humanity, just for the purposes of crimes against humanity. And it's difficult to see what the distinction is. And you mentioned genocide. One of the crimes was extermination, which is a crime against humanity, and that was not held to be demonstrated. But there are 2 points about this. I mean, firstly, extermination seems very close to genocide. They're practically the same thing. So why wasn't genocide in the indictment? But secondly, one of the reasons why some of these things didn't stick is because the prosecutor issued the indictments, the original warrants, in May. I think it was about May the 20th they were issued. And when the pretrial chamber were looking at this evidence, they could only look at evidence up until the 20th of May. And on that basis, they made their decisions. If you were to look at some of the evidence that came in after that, you might have got a different decision, right? Because significant things happened in Gaza in June and July, where there was further, attacks and further violations.
So when you say a different decision, you don't mean not issuing an arrest warrant. You mean issuing it for more crimes as well.
I mean that the pretrial chamber might have confirmed everything,
right?
Instead of just confirming most of it.
I see.
They confirmed about 75% of it, but they might have confirmed the other 25%. If they'd been looking at data in June and July, right? August and September, operations in Gaza had kind of stopped by then, and they shifted towards operations in Lebanon against Hezbollah. But there was ongoing data. But of course, we're lawyers and we know that that's how it works. If the warrant is up to the 20th of May, then that's all you can look at. Right? But I mean, rest assured, there's enough serious stuff here against Netanyahu and the defense minister, and against the one Palestinian who's indicted, that if they were convicted, they would get the 30-year, which is the maximum sentence. The court usually hands out. It's not, we're not talking chicken feed. There's a lot of serious stuff in these indictments.
Of course. But then I wonder, I mean, if there's little practical application of the arrest warrants and their enforcement or their execution, can it still be considered a symbolic victory for humanity?
Yes, because effectively, whatever the French say aside, and I'm just basing this on the fact that this was something that was sort of tweeted last night, and I haven't had a chance to digest fully, but most of the states, for example, of Europe, are basically telling Netanyahu he can't come to visit them. Yeah.
And they're saying this officially, or
behind? Well, yeah, there was, in the sense that if Israel says we'd like to come to Britain, the Foreign Office will send back a reply saying, if you come to Britain, you'll be arrested.
I see.
In which case, don't come. Don't come, because that's the answer. And that says most states in Europe will say that. And that is a powerful symbol. It's not as bad as it seems. The one state that the Israeli leadership, like Netanyahu, want to go to is America, and they can still go there because it's not an ICC signatory. There's an interesting question about whether they can go to the United Nations, because the United Nations Assembly is in New York, but it's not considered to just be American territory. There's certain privileges and immunities that apply to UN personnel. And so that's an interesting question. People say, well, maybe he can't go to the General Assembly. Maybe the General Assembly, if he went there, he would be detained. But the problem with that is that why does he need to go to the General Assembly? He can just send somebody else to read his speech out. Right? All he has to do is to pick somebody who hasn't been indicted, which is almost all of the Israeli government, and he can send them to the US, or he can send them to Britain,
On their diplomatic missions and whatnot.
So there's only 2 Israelis who've been indicted. He's got a whole cabinet of people he can send to go and do his.
And his defense minister was indicted, and I think he's been relieved from his post.
Yes, I can't remember his name now.
Something with a G. I'm also
forgotten his name now. It's Yoav something, and Gallant. Yoav Gallant.
Yes, that's right.
And Yoav Gallant was the other Israeli who was indicted. And what's interesting is that he has actually been fired. He was fired a couple of weeks ago. And I think that's just a coincidence. I don't think there's any link. I mean, some people conspire and say, well, maybe they're just going to throw Gallant to the wolves. They're going to send him to the ICC, and he can be sacrificed. But I don't believe that for a second. I think it's just coincidence. There were 2 other Palestinians indicted beside the main guy who goes by the nickname Defi, but they've subsequently been killed. So they don't actually appear on the new arrest warrants because they're dead.
I see.
So yeah, Gallant was. I remember now. His name is Yoav Gallant.
So it seems anything else that we can sort of talk about or discuss in the days to come would all be just speculative. So I suppose we'll keep an eye on this space, and perhaps when developments do occur, we'll have another sit down and another discussion on how this arrest warrant procedure, proceeded with, in a sense.
Well, I think that we need to think about the end of January, because at the moment, remember, you're basically in a lame duck. We've got a lame duck presidency and a lame duck Congress, which is that they don't have any authority to do anything, and presidents and the Congress usually don't do that much in this period because they consider it unethical, to act when we're waiting for a new president.
They're just expected to maintain the status quo.
Yeah, which is slightly odd because Biden has made this decision to send long-range missiles to Ukraine and to take the gloves off.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is wrong. You shouldn't do that during the period of what we call the lame duck period. But it'll be interesting to see what happens when the Trump administration starts and what he does about this, because he has the power to make a lot of decisions under executive order that could limit other states from cooperating with the ICC.
Absolutely. So we'll keep watching this space. We'll keep informing our audience about developments that occur in this area of discussion. Thank you so much, Alex, for your expert insight, and thank you to our audience for listening in. Stay tuned to this space, and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you and have a nice day.